trade. So in the international trade chapter, you probably found some of this material to be quite challenging. So I wanted to walk through a couple of the examples in the text and just talk a little bit about absolute and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage is going to be when one nation can produce at a cost that's lower relative to another nation. So what does that mean? We have a hypothetical example here. It's looking at the production of oil and corn for both Saudi Arabia and the United States of America. Um, Knowing that these countries probably, we know a little bit about Saudi Arabia, we know a little bit about US, we probably can intuitively say that the cost of oil production in Saudi Arabia is probably lower than the United States, and the cost of corn production, because agriculture is not something that Saudi Arabia focuses on because of their climate and topography. They're not going to have a strength there, so the US does. When we look at the numbers, we see the same thing. So the United States can produce more corn and more corn but less oil. And Saudi Arabia can produce more oil and less corn. And so we have totals. If we're just assuming that Saudi Arabia and the United States are the only countries in this hypothetical world we have. And then we want to look at an idea, and this is all based off of their production possibilities frontier, as you see in the textbook, of how much they could produce if they just focus on the things in which they have an absolute advantage. So Saudi Arabia can produce 240 barrels of oil if they produce no corn, and the United States can produce 640 bushels of corn if they produce no oil. So the idea here being that more oil can be produced if Saudi Arabia just focuses on that which they have an absolute advantage in, the production of oil. And the United States can produce more corn in total that can be produced if they're not trading, if they just focus on the production of corn. So there would only have been 340 bushels of corn produced before trade, but when the U.S. focuses on that which they have an absolute advantage in, the production of corn, there'll be more corn available for everyone. And so at this point we can trade, right? The United States only needs, say, needs 80 barrels of oil. We don't know if Saudi Arabia needs 120 barrels of oil, but this is just hypothetical. And so they can obviously give some to the United States in exchange for the corn that they need, which is only 20 bushels. So in the above tables, it is possible to have different possibilities for the United States to specialize in the production of corn and Saudi Arabia to specialize in the production of oil. So again, intuitively, this makes sense. Why spend scarce water resources in Saudi Arabia trying to grow corn when the U.S. is very well suited for corn production? Likewise, it's relatively less expensive to drill for oil in Saudi Arabia versus the cost of looking for it and drilling for it in the U.S. Therefore, specialization leads to an increase in production of both goods. So all an absolute advantage means is that one nation can produce at a lower cost relative to another nation. We can look at this in terms of opportunity costs. So let's take a look at the production possibilities frontier for the United States. And you might want to pull this section up in your text when we're working through this video. So the production possibilities frontier for the United States shows us that the total maximum amount of oil we could produce if we just produce oil would be 150 barrels. And the total maximum amount of corn we could produce, so here's the 150 barrels. And this means that there's no corn production in the United States. Now, if we look on the corn axis or the x-axis, we see that there is no oil being produced and there's just corn being grown and harvested. So when we look at this production possibilities frontier, and we also look at the production possibilities frontier for Saudi Arabia for oil and corn, we can see that the opportunity cost of oil versus corn for the United States, they're not really giving up that much corn when they choose, or that much oil when they choose to produce corn versus oil, and this is for the United States. But they would be giving up a lot of corn if they decided to produce oil. And so that high opportunity cost of producing the corn means that they have their absolute advantage in the growing and harvesting of corn. So said again, the United States does not have to give up too much oil when they produce corn. And if they were to produce oil, they would give up a lot of corn. And therefore, that high opportunity cost in the production of corn means that they have an absolute advantage in the production of corn versus oil. So something we could ask ourselves is, well, at what price will trade occur? So let's take a look at our schedule again. So here, the total amount of corn that is produced is 640 bushels after trade if we're specializing, and the total amount of oil available in this two-country world is 240 barrels. So we can determine the price that would occur by looking at the opportunity cost of one item for the other. And so let's look at it from the perspective of the United States. So before trade, the U.S. could produce 320 bushels of corn and they could produce 80 barrels of oil at the same time, given the available land, labor, and capital in the economy. Therefore, we know that the before trade opportunity cost was 4 bushels to 1 barrel. So the opportunity cost of corn would be that we would give up 4 bushels of corn for 1 barrel of oil. So trade will occur if the U.S. is able to trade up to 4 bushels of corn for 1 barrel of oil. So obviously they're going to want to trade less than 4 bushels of corn for 1 barrel of oil. And any price of less than 4 bushels of corn for 1 barrel of oil will induce trade. And trade will therefore allow us to benefit from the lower opportunity costs of production, because we can see in this two-economy world, if we specialize in that which we have an absolute advantage in, we will have gains from trade. That is, the total amount of corn has increased after trade because the U.S. is specializing in that which they have an absolute advantage of, and the total amount of oil that's being produced is increasing by 40 barrels because Saudi Arabia is specializing in that which they have an advantage of. And then trade can occur at any opportunity cost less than 4 bushels to 1 barrel of oil, because that is the before trade opportunity cost, and therefore any price below 4 bushels is going to be advantageous to the United States. So that's absolute advantage. A comparative advantage is a little bit different. Comparative advantage says that there can be countries that actually hold the absolute advantage in the production of both goods or services, but there's still a benefit from trade. And the way we define this is the goods in which a nation has the greatest productivity advantage or its smallest productivity disadvantage, so the least disadvantageous good produced, will be its item of comparative advantage. So also the goods a nation can produce at a lower cost when measured in terms of opportunity cost. So let's look at some opportunity costs. And these were this was also something that was discussed in the book, but these concepts are rather confusing, so I think it's good to go over them together. So here we see that 4 workers in the United States can make 1,000 pairs of shoes. So 4 workers making 1,000 pairs of shoes, 1 worker making 250 pairs of shoes. Now, in Mexico, it takes 5 workers to make 1,000 pairs of shoes. So 1 worker can make only 200 pairs of shoes. Obviously, we can see that it takes less workers in the United States to make the same amount of shoes. So there is an absolute advantage in production there when we're assuming that the only input into production is the cost of the workers. Now, let's assume that in this hypothetical two-country economy, or two-country world economy. We have the United States and Mexico, and the items we're looking at here are just going to be shoes and refrigerators. So one worker in the US can make 1,000 refrigerators. In Mexico, it takes 4 workers to make the same amount of refrigerators. So one worker can make 250 refrigerators. And here, one worker can make 1,000 refrigerators. Again, we can see that it's obvious. The United States, again, has an absolute advantage in the production of refrigerators. It only takes one worker in the US to make 1,000 refrigerators, yet one worker in Mexico can only make 250. So the US has both an absolute advantage in the production of refrigerators and an absolute advantage in the production of shoes. So why would the US not make shoes and refrigerators? And why would Mexico make shoes and refrigerators? Well, there are still gains from trade because of comparative advantage. So the US should produce those goods where it has the greatest productivity advantage. So where does it have the greatest productivity advantage? By looking at this, you can probably tell that it's in refrigerators, right? There's the biggest difference here. It takes 4 times the amount of workers in Mexico to make one refrigerator, whereas it only takes 5/4 the amount of workers in Mexico to make the same amount of shoes. But let's go through the math a little bit. So here we table it out, and we see that in the US, to make 1,000 pairs of shoes takes 4 workers. To make 1,000 refrigerators takes 1 worker. And in Mexico, the amount of labor needed is 5 workers to make 1,000 pairs of shoes and 4 workers to make 1,000 refrigerators. So, stated again, the US can produce 1,000 pairs of shoes with 4/5 as many workers as Mexico. So this is comparative advantage compared to Mexico. Are there potential trade gains? The US can produce 1,000 refrigerators with 1/4 as many workers as Mexico. Okay, so it takes 4 workers to every 1 worker in Mexico to make the same refrigerator. So therefore, the opportunity cost is in refrigerators, and the US should produce, the larger opportunity cost is in refrigerators, and the US should produce refrigerators, and Mexico should produce shoes. So there's still going to be gains for trade if they do that. The US should just specialize in the production of refrigerators because this is where they have their largest opportunity cost. If the US worker decides to, or if US industry decides to give up the production of refrigerators, that one worker is going to not be making 1,000 refrigerators, and they're going to instead be making shoes. But that one worker is only going to make an additional 250 pairs of shoes. Whereas if we move that one worker from shoe manufacturing, we'll lose 250 pairs of shoes, but we'll gain 1,000 refrigerators by moving one worker to refrigerators. So they have a larger opportunity cost. That is, it costs them more in terms of refrigerators to produce shoes, and therefore they should produce refrigerators, and Mexico should produce shoes. So absolute and comparative advantage. You might see some questions on the exam that is asking you to compute how to calculate comparative advantage, or how to assess whether there is absolute advantage. And I highly recommend taking a look at the questions in your quiz and make sure that you're able to answer those kinds of problems. Let me know if you do have any questions, but they will follow the same methodology that we've been applying here. Okay, and there are a couple of other things to think about in this chapter that I found quite interesting. While I'm not covering everything in the chapter that I want you to know for the exams, I do want to touch on some very important points. So something we are looking at in this chapter was something called intra-industry trade. So intra-industry trade is international trade of goods, or it could be service-oriented within the same industry. The other thing that we see happening is that economies of scale exist, and these can drive intra-industry trade. So what are economies of scale? Economies of scale are the idea that as you increase production beyond a certain point, and normally it's a large volume of production, you'll have lower average costs because your fixed costs are going to be spread over more and more units. So that lowers the average cost. When you have lower average costs, you have higher profits. Um, a lot of auto manufacturers follow this model where you see a lot of inter-industry trade between countries because of economies of scale. So say, for example, BMW is a German auto manufacturer. They might have plants outside of Germany where they're making and manufacturing cars. They certainly have sales locations outside of their country where you can buy their vehicles. The idea being that they could actually supply their entire country with all the cars that they need. However, there exists a way for them to sell to their own domestic market and then sell to other markets, and this provides diverse products for consumers while still allowing them to produce a large quantity and benefit from the lower average costs in an economies of scale model. So two reasons why we have intra-industry trade. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage would suggest that we wouldn't have a lot of intra-industry trade. However, we do see it due to highly specialized and very, I would say, split production. So production being very specialized, and also economies of scale benefiting industry and driving firms to increase production and then trade globally, enabling them to capture those lower average costs.